Welcome everybody to the second GNCC College Curling webinar. Our guest speaker tonight is Roger Roulette, who is former board member of the USCA, former college curling committee member who, if you've been curling long enough, know him as the person who had to approve your draws if they weren't standardized before you could run your event. And he's here tonight to give us a primer on Bonspiel designs of various sorts. So Roger, take it away.
All right, and this will be a primer. So if you want to know how to design a draw with 4 events on 3 sheets for 18 teams, I'm not going to do that tonight, but we'll talk a little bit about general design and how you can choose between different event types and choose events that might be simple for you to run. So let's see if I can pull up my window here.
Should have been up.
There we go.
There we go.
All right. So the main goal of designing a competition is really threefold. One is you want to determine an unambiguous champion in some sort of predefined manner that all your teams understand. You want to provide for fair and equal competition between all the teams. And the one that usually gets college curlers when they're designing their Bonspiels, you want your event to be appropriate for the ice time you have available, the number of sheets, and the number of draw times or number of scheduled times you can actually curl. So we'll talk a little bit about that as we go through this. So it's just some general principles about Bonspiel design. The general kind of rules are the winners play winners, losers play losers. You want to avoid back-to-back games with teams if at all possible. And more than 3 games per day, I think, is the recommendation. If you're an adult, it's really 2 games per day. But for college students, I think the college curling rules still allow up to 3 games per day. And you want to avoid teams, if you can, playing the same sheets or the same stones back-to-back, because that can be an unfair advantage for a team who has played a sheet just recently or has played a set of rocks and knows which ones are wonky. Preliminary games, if you use them, if you're going to have playoffs, the preliminary games should equal or exceed the number of playoff games. And playoffs, if they are used to determine your winners, are normally single elimination games. Although consolation games for your semifinal losers to determine the 3rd place finisher is certainly acceptable. And all of these principles are kind of embodied in what the college curling guidelines are for designing your competitions. So just some limitations. So these are the things that are going to determine how many teams you can have in your event, and then maybe what kind of event you design to determine your champion or your event winners. And so some definitions. So a round of play is a sequence of times where every team will play a game that is not yet eliminated. So if you've got 16 teams in a Bonspiel, you have to process 16 teams for each round of play. And that's going to determine, depending on how much ice time you have, how many rounds you'll need to complete a competition or whether or not it will fit into the available time. So a little bit of math geekery here. There's a minimum of log 2 to the base end rounds of play required to determine a unique winner. So to boil this down, it means if you have 8 teams, you need to play at least 3 rounds of games to work yourself down to a unique winner. So in other words, 8 goes to 4, goes to 2, goes to your champion. If you have 10 to 16 teams, you'll need 4 rounds of play to determine a champion. And for 18 to 32 teams, you'll need 5 rounds of play. So you can see it goes up pretty quickly as you increase the number of teams in your event.
Okay, we got our first question.
Mm-hmm.
Can you get log 2n on your typical college student calculator?
Well, it's just the power of 2 required to come up to the number you want. So yes, you can take log to the base 2 on a calculator. I don't have one in front of me, but it's doable. But the thing you need to remember is you need 3 rounds of play for 8 teams. For 10 to 16, you'll need 4 rounds of play. And for 18 or more teams, you'll need 5 rounds of play up to 32. I don't think anyone's going to be running a 32-team event. I would say most events are going to probably be around 16 teams.
If they're over 16, just as a reminder to the college students, you have to get permission from Gordon before you can run that.
Right. So an even number of teams is normally required for you to run an event. It is possible in some formats to run an odd number of teams, but it generates enormous complications and will actually also present some issues in terms of teams getting in the number of games that they're expecting. So a typical Bonspiel is designed so that each team in the competition will play at least 3 games. It makes it worth their while to travel. So when you get into odd numbers of teams, you're going to wind up with some events. If you try to run an odd number, you're going to wind up with some teams only getting in 2 games. So it's just easier to recruit another team to fill it out, and it makes your scheduling so much easier if you have a even number of teams and you don't have so many buys running through your competition.
And that's why the host team is allowed to stick in an extra team to round up the numbers. That's in the rules.
Exactly. Just a reminder, so the number of rounds of play that you need to have in your event to determine the winner is a minimum. So I did put that in bold. Some competition formats will require more than the minimum number of rounds of play. I think in a bracketed Bonspiel, which we'll talk about, often you require 1 more than the minimum to get all of the events completed. So just keep that in mind. This just gives you the minimum. So now another definition is a draw. Yeah, a draw is a scheduled time in which the teams compete. And that may not be a full round of play. If you've got 16 teams and you don't have 8 sheets of ice, then it will take you a couple of rounds, right, to process 16 teams. If you have 4 sheets of ice, you can process 8 teams at a time. So a draw is just a scheduled time. And of course, that will be like a 2 or 2.5 hour segment where you've got some ice time. The number of draws required for competition depends on how many sheets of ice you have, how many teams you have in a competition, and the format of the competition. And different formats may require a different number of draws. So the thing you need to remember is you can process twice as many teams per draw as you have sheets. So 2 teams per draw. And so if you want to figure out quickly what the minimum number of draws is for running a competition, then there's a little formula for you. It's 1/2 times the number of rounds required. That's depending on the number of teams, times the number of teams you have divided by the number of sheets you have. And that'll tell you how many scheduled ice times you need to complete your event as a minimum. Now, if you do this long enough, you'll discover that there are some magic numbers in Bonspiels that make it much easier and more efficient for you to run the competition. And one of those magic numbers, it has to do with the number of sheets. So if you can arrange your Bonspiel to have a number of teams in it that is a multiple of 2n, where n is the number of sheets. So if you've got a 4-sheet club, multiples of 8 are really nice because you can process 8 at a time, which means you can process 2 rounds and have 2 draws and do a complete round and have everybody taken care of. So if you've got 16 teams on 4 sheets, that's 2 rounds to complete, or 2 draws to complete a round. If you make it 18 teams, now it's going to take you 3 draws to process 1 round of play. And generally, you have to complete a round of play to determine who's won and lost before you can do the next round. So if you can arrange for a multiple of twice the number of sheets you have, some multiple of that, it makes life really easy. Other magic numbers for Bonspiels are powers of 2. So 8 or 16 are really nice numbers to run Bonspiels without having lots of buys. So if you happen to have a number of teams or planning to have a number of teams in your Bonspiel that's not a multiple of twice the number of sheets, then you're going to have to use the next larger value of 2n to calculate the minimum number of draws. So if you've got 16 teams in your event, 18 teams in your event, you're really thinking about a 32-team event with lots of buys. So just think about it that way. So once you go over 16, things get a little more complicated for
Let's pause there for a second, Roger.
Clubs or less. Pardon?
Let's pause there for a second. Does anybody have any questions about that? I always have to stop and think when he rattles these numbers off at me when we're driving in the car. No questions? You're all old hands.
They got math. All right, so now we know how many draws we need, right? So if you've got, let's say you've got 16 teams in your event, so we'll have a little quiz, and you've got 4 sheets in your club. Okay, how many draw times do you need to complete your event minimum? And don't everybody jump at once. So 16 teams, 4 sheets of ice. So how many rounds do we need?
We need 4 rounds.
Okay, we need 4 rounds. We've got 16 teams, right? So 1/2 times 4 times 16 divided by 4 is 8 rounds or 8 draws, right? So you would need 8 individual times on the ice to complete that event, minimum, depending on the type of event that you're running. So that's the kind of calculation you're going to have to do when you're setting up your Bonspiel to determine how many teams you can actually invite. So draw timing. So how does it work out in terms
Hang on
of
a sec, Roger.
Yep.
I wanted to say something there, but I had muted myself. And that's really important to pass on to your colleagues, is you need to know that before you send out the invite.
Yeah, you can't put 10 pounds of fertilizer in a 5-pound sack. So if you've got, more draws required than you have ice time, then you can't really run the event. There's no way to fix it because these are the minimum requirements to come up with a unique winner in your event. So let's talk about timing. So normally you should really allow about 2.5 hours per draw. People try to cheat this down to 2 hours and 15 minutes or 2 hours, but the reality is to play an 8-in game, it takes at least 2 hours. It's slower when you have less experienced players, or it could be longer too. I know some players at our club that play 3-hour games, but 2 hours is normally the amount of time you would have. You need another half hour really to account for the occasional extra end and to allow your ice crew to get out and prep the ice, for the next game. If you do schedule for 2.5 hours between draws, you'll be unlikely to run behind on your schedule. If you try to schedule it tighter, you're going to wind up running over schedule anyway. So it's always my recommendation to just schedule that time in advance. That way you can just keep things running on a normal time schedule. If you're going to use tiebreakers, so you're going to do a draw shot challenge or other tiebreakers, which will be required in certain formats, make sure you allow some extra time. 2.5 hours might be okay. It'd be a little bit of a squeeze if you're just running, say, 1 or 2, draw shot challenge shots. If you're going to do something more complicated, then you should probably allow, an extra half hour. We'll talk about tiebreakers a little bit later. And then really importantly, this is kind of a big one for me, is that, I think it's really important to provide your players with good ice conditions. So you should probably allow some additional time every 3 to 4 draws for your ice crew to get out and scrape the ice and maintain those really good and fun conditions. I don't like playing on straight, slow ice. I bet you don't either. So it's really nice to make sure you have that time available. A great time to schedule a scrape is like during lunch or maybe overnight, between. So there are various ways you can schedule that in without making it too tough on your schedule.
Okay, and Nancy has a question.
Roger, for those of us blessed to curl on arena ice, do you have any suggestions in terms of how often we should zam?
I don't. The main thing is you need to maintain whatever you can do to maintain the pebble so that you've got decent ice speed. I don't know how does the Zamboni run help you in terms of speed? How many times can you normally play before you notice a decline in playing conditions?
Well, actually, we've been playing 3 or 4 draws before we zam again, just because you have to clear everything off. You have to clear off pull up the hacks and clear off all the stones, and it just slows things down. So
yeah,
we've been only zamming at the end or beginning of the day.
Yeah, and if it's every 3 or 4 draws, then that's probably the best you can do. But and I know in arenas you're really pressed for time, right? So you've got more time limitations than perhaps you would have at a dedicated ice facility. So you're under a little bit tighter time pressures as well. But anything that you can do when you schedule your event to provide that additional time for maintaining playing conditions is really, I think, it makes the event more fun. And certainly I think it makes it a lot fairer in terms of competition. So let's talk about some typical competition formats. There are really three that are in very common usage. One's a bracketed Bonspiel. That's probably the one most people are familiar with. There's also a pooled round robin. That's the format that's used in the USA Curling College Nationals. And then there's a Schenkel or Swiss system, which is actually borrowed from the chess world, but is a nice, really efficient draw system. So we'll talk about all three. So bracketed Bonspiels are really a modified version of a triple knockout. And a true triple knockout, every team's got to lose at least 3 times before they're eliminated. But no one's got the time to run those events. That a lot of playdowns are run this way, like I think in Saskatchewan. That's how they run their Briar and Scotties playdowns. But they take a long time to run. So typically in a modified triple knockout, what happens is you either have to lose 3 games or you have to lose in your 3rd game. That way everybody gets to play 3 games. But you do get teams eliminated in a timely fashion so you can conclude the event. Typically, a bracketed Bonspiel will lead to 4 event winners. So there will be a championship bracket, which will lead to an undefeated champion. There will be a loser's bracket where all the teams who've lost their first game compete to win that bracket. There will be typically a C bracket, which is kind of typically a hodgepodge of teams that have lost their first 2 games or have lost in their 2nd game in the A event. And then the D event is typically kind of the bronze medal game. It's really not so much an event as a consolation game for the A semifinal losers. And that's a typical way a draw would typically be set up for a bracketed Bonspiel. There are some advantages to this type of event. The main advantage is it leads to an unambiguous and undefeated champion. And there are no tiebreakers required. It's all win-loss. So teams are simply matched up. So winners play winners, losers play losers until somebody has won all their games. The disadvantages of this particular type of competition design is there's some pretty complex timing requirements because certain games have to be finished before other events can be started. And it can be a little complex, especially if you have not one of those magic numbers of teams in your event. It can be a little complicated to make sure all the games get played ahead of the next ones that need to be played without putting people into back-to-back games and so on. It may also require 1 extra draw above the minimums we've talked about. And it is a little bit sensitive to seeding. If you match up 2 of the, say, favorite teams early in the event, then they don't have a chance to meet in the semifinals or finals. It's not a terribly sensitive to seeding, but it can be sensitive to how teams are deployed in that first round. The one other disadvantage of this event is all teams in the event may not play the same number of games. Usually the teams that wind up in the C event play 1 or 2 extra games, which can be a bit of a grind for them. They may decide that that's an advantage or not. I don't know. I think the longer you curl, the less you consider that an advantage.
Yes. Quick question. Do you talk about the use of the term D event? Because I believe there's been some discussion between, I know Gordon doesn't call it the D event where they play. We call it the D event in the East. The point is it's the losers of the semifinals, whatever you call that event.
Right. In the East, that's called the D event. But so to make it simple, there's a championship bracket. Those are all teams who have won all their games. There's the losers bracket, which is the teams who have lost their first game, but continue to win the rest of their games out to the end. Then there's the C event, which is kind of a collection of teams who have lost a bunch of games. Okay. So they've either lost their 2nd game in the championship bracket, or they've lost a game and they've lost 2 games They lost in the A bracket and they lost in the C bracket. So they'll populate this kind of catch-all event. That's usually the C event. And then there's the kind of bronze medal game, which I'm calling the D event. But that's the fourth event. That's pretty typical Bonspiel arrangement. There are other ways of doing it, but that's pretty common. So that's this slide's actually just a summary of what I just said. The A event is single elimination, leading to a unique winner. And then the other events get populated as teams lose in various parts of the competition. And teams that lose their third played game are typically eliminated except for that bronze medal game, which is the A event semifinal losers typically play an additional game to determine third place. If you have enough sheets and draw times available, then the losers of the B semifinal could play another kind of consolation game. So the B semifinal losers could play an E final. So you can have 5 events, but that requires an extra draw. So you just have to have the available ice time to do that. All right. So how do you put together this, just kind of generically, or think strategically, how do you put together this kind of event? The very first thing you do is you play all of your A event games, however many rounds it takes to get through all of the teams, or how many draws it takes to get through a complete round. So you process all of the teams in your event. When all the A event games are complete, then you'll know who's moving on in the A, and all the losers will move on to the B event. So then you can start your B event games, and the winners of that stay in the B event, and then the losers go on to the C event. Okay, so after you complete all of your B event games, so then you can start your second round of A event games, which will have now half as many teams. And the winners of that will stay in the A event, the championship event, and the losers will go on to the C event. So now you've got your C event populated. So the losers in their first B game go into the C event. The losers in the second A game go into the C event. So now you can start your C event games. You process all the teams through the C event until they're complete. And now you're pretty much set up for semifinals at that stage. So now you can alternate or combine. You have very few teams now in each event. You can combine A, B, and C event games to process them through until you have unique winners in each of those events. The real trick to this, and I guess the complicated part, is you need to distribute the games on sheets so that teams don't play on the same sheet back to back, if at all possible. If you do put them on the same sheet back to back, then you should switch the color of the rocks. So in most of our events, we assign rock colors just to be able to control teams taking advantage by playing the same rocks twice, and certainly twice in a row. All right, so what does it look like in terms of schedule? So here's a 16-team event with 4 sheets with 4 events. And you can see that we've got to process 2 draws to go through a complete round. Because we have 16 teams, we can process them 8 at a time. So you can run 4 games and draw 1. You can run another 4 games and draw 2. And that will complete all of your A event games. So at this point, you now know who has been demoted to the B event. So there'll be 8 teams that lost. They will now populate the B event, and you can process all of the first round games in the B event in a single draw. So that's in round 3. And now you can go back and you can complete the second round of your A event, which now has only 4 teams. And that's going to now populate your B event. So your losers in round 3 and your losers in round 4 will now go on to the C event, and you can run them off in round 5, and there'll be 8 of them. So they can go off all in one draw. And then from there, you can combine them to get to the end. So we can run our B semifinals in round 6 and our A semifinals in round 6. You can run your C semifinals in round 7, and then you can run your finals in round 8. Now you notice I put a couple of strategic arrows down there. So those are really good places to put a break in your event. And you'd like to put a break between round 2 and round 3, because if you don't, then the losers in round 2, which will populate the B event, will have to play back-to-back game. So this would be excellent to say run draws 1 and 2 on a Friday night, Then you could run round 3 on Saturday morning, and you'd have a nice break in between. Nobody's playing back to back. And then maybe it'd be nice to have a lunch break between rounds 4 and 5 to prevent the losers in round 4, which are going to go into the C event, from playing a back-to-back game. So maybe have lunch and a scrape between rounds 4 and 5. And then your rounds 7 and 8 would be played on Sunday morning. And the C event competitors have to play back-to-back, and that's just too bad. They're in the C event, so that's what happens when you're in the C event. But that's pretty typical that Sunday morning you may have to play back-to-back games to complete the event. So that would be what a typical bracketed Bonspiel schedule might look like. It's a little different if you have a different number of teams, but this is a fairly large event, 16 teams. And you can see you can squeeze that in 8 draws, 2 on Friday night, 1, 2, 3, 4 on Saturday, very easy schedule, and then 2 on Sunday morning. So it easily fit within the 2-day schedule. Half day Friday, full day Saturday, half day Sunday. So that's bracketed Bonspiel. Any questions before we move on to the next format? All right, hearing none. Round robins. This is an all-play-all format. It's typically divided into small pools. A good pool size is 4. The advantages of this particular type of competition format is everyone normally plays the same number of preliminary games, so that's great. So if you have a event that has pools of 4, everyone's going to play a round robin within that pool, which would be 3 games. So play every other team in that pool. And there's no question how many games you're going to play during that preliminary round. It's also easy to design and administer. Once you set the pools up, you know your schedule. You know when you're going to play and who you're going to play. The disadvantages of this particular format is you do need small pools, and you will have to do multiples of 4, right? Possibly 5. You can run these round robins with 5, but you have to have a bye every round. So you have to have a 4-game round robin instead of 3, and that dramatically increases the number of draws. But with 14 pools, then you're going to have 3 preliminary rounds. Small pools are very sensitive to seeding. So if you put all your best teams in the one pool, then they're going to knock each other off. And this is something that we really pay attention to when, for example, in the USA Curling College Nationals, is getting those pools to be reasonably, representative so the teams are spread out. So something to be aware of if you're running this format. Tiebreakers are required to determine who moves on to the playoffs, and playoffs will be required as well. So just something to be aware of. The tiebreakers do add some extra complexity and a little extra time to your event. All right, so the basic design is divide your teams into pools of 4. If it's possible, try to seed the teams in a way so that you prevent concentration of strong teams in one pool. That's not always possible. Maybe you just do it random, but just be advised that seeding does have an impact on how the event turns out. Each pool plays a 3-game round robin. Then you take the win-loss record and tiebreakers to seed teams into playoffs. And I'll show you an example of how this might work, again, with a 16-team event. If you have 2 pools, then you can have a 1-game playoff. So the first place team in the A pool plays the first place team in the B pool. That's for the championship. The runner-up is a loser of that game. Third place would be the second place team in the A pool against the second place team in the B pool, and so on. You can play as many playoffs as you want as long as you have the available ice time available. If you have 3 pools, it gets a little more complicated. Then you got to have a semifinals between the winners of your A, B, and C pools, and then the best wildcard team from the 3 pools, and then your finals are the winners of the semifinal games. And if you have 4 pools, that would be a 16-team event. Then you need a 2-game playoff. So your semis are the winners of the 4 pools, and your finals would be the winners of the semifinals. You can run a consolation playoff as well, as long as you have available ice time. So you could take A2, B2, C2, and D2 in that 4-pool format, and they could, form a consolation bracket winner as well. But that, of course, requires some extra rounds of play. So a typical schedule looks like this. It's pretty easy to run. So in rounds 1 and 2, you would run your first games in the A, B, C, and D pool. And then in rounds 3 and 4, you'd run your second games in the A, B, C, and D pools. In rounds 5 and 6, you would run your 4 games again, your A, B, C, and D pools again. Process all the teams. Then you would total up all of their win-loss records and their tie breaks and decide who's playing in the semifinals, and then depending on who wins that and who plays in the finals. So it's pretty easy to administer because the schedule is fixed in advance. Once you slot teams into their position, then it's fairly easy to make the sheet assignments and who plays whom. Again, you probably want to put some strategic breaks in here. So the one break you really want is between the pool play and the playoffs. Again, you can do the playoffs on Sunday morning. Notice again, this is an eight draw event. So you could play 2 on Friday night. You could play 4 on Saturday, and you could play 2 on Sunday, for example. So pretty straightforward. Some of you probably run the round robin events before. Yes, no?
I'm muted. Maybe Thomas, but I think he
Yep.
had to leave. He said he had to go after 45
Okay.
minutes.
No, I'm so
Are you still here?
yeah. I guess for us, I think we usually do round robin pools, but I have developed maybe a few formats where we could use more of a bracketed format. We're a 3-sheet club, so it kind of limits us in that way, but yeah.
And I know we use the format at Utica that Roger's about to talk about for the college spiel, and I'm pretty sure RPI uses brackets.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, not RPI, Schenectady.
Right. And broomstones, yeah. So the Schenkel format is a very efficient format for running very large events. It's again a winner play winner, loser play loser format. And all teams will play the same number of games or preliminary games, depending on how you set it up. The advantages of this particular type of event, again, is very simple to administer. There's not going to be any timing issues because the timing, just like the round robin event, is pretty much pre-scheduled. The only thing that's more complicated about it is you don't know who's going to play whom until each round is done. But it's fairly simple to administer for any even number of teams and any number of sheets. One of the disadvantages of the round robin play is you really need those multiples of 4. But for the Schenkel format, you don't have to have a multiple of 4. And if you have pool play, you can even have unequal number of teams in each pool. So this is very adaptable to very large pool play in a playoff. It is insensitive to seeding because the pools can be actually quite large. And so teams will sort themselves out. You can actually pair them randomly if you want in the first round. And the one thing I like about this event is if you lose one game, you're not eliminated. You still have a chance to make it into the playoff round and win the championship game. And I think that's a huge advantage to be able to go into an event and have one really bad game and still not necessarily be completely out of it. So that's an advantage. Well, of course, a disadvantage, like the round robin play, you need tiebreakers are required to determine scheduling and who plays whom. And again, pools do have to have an even number of teams. There's no way you can run this type of event, or a round robin event for that matter, with an odd number of teams. You could run a round robin with 5 as long as you want to put up with buys each round. It's pretty inefficient. But in general, you need an even number of teams to run these types of events. So let's talk about tiebreakers, just as a little segue. And this would apply to either round robin events or to the Schenkel Swiss system, because you need a way to decide who's going to qualify for playoffs. And in the case of the Schenkel, who's going to play whom in the next round. There's a number of different ways you can do tiebreakers, and I'm going to recommend a couple. One traditional way of doing tiebreakers is to use the score differential or the number of ends scored, or something along those lines. The thing that I don't like about this, and I don't recommend this, is to be used as a tiebreaker, even though it may seem as easy to implement, It's more dependent on scheduling than it is on the skill of the team that's involved. So if you happen to get scheduled against the worst team in the event and you rack up a big score, does that really mean that you have the best skill to move on to the next round or to the playoffs? So it might have more to do with who you play than necessarily the skill of your team. It's also not conducive to sportsmanship, because if you're doing score differentials, then of course you can't quit a game early. You have to play all games out to 8 ends, and it invites teams to run up the score. So I don't recommend this at all for using it as a tiebreaker. I would prefer to use a draw shot challenge, which is limited to the skill of your own team. And that can be 1 or 2 shots after each game. And you can accumulate them. That is, you can, add them up over time after each game to determine a tiebreaker. That's pretty efficient because you only have to do 1 extra shots or 2 after each game. Or you can just do 1 big tiebreaker at the beginning. And we've used this in our college Bonspiel. Use a team draw shot challenge. It's called the Utica Shootout because you don't have to do as much measuring. And we use this in a lot of our other Bonspiel events at our club. So each team member will throw a DSC after their first game. And the scoring is really simple. If your rock touches the 12-foot, you score 1 point. If your rock touches the 8-foot, you score 2. 4-foot, 3. If you're fully within the 4-foot or touching a 2-foot button, that's 4 points. If you're covering the pin, that's 5 points. And then your team DSC is just the sum of all those points. If you need a tiebreaker, then you do measure the skip rock distance as a secondary tiebreak. And if you're still tied, you can use as a tertiary tiebreak the best individual scores for the shootout. It's pretty rare that we have to run another tiebreaker to break a tie. It usually only happens if a team misses all their shots. So they score a 0 and they have a 73 inches on their skip rock. So we occasionally have to make them go out and throw another rock. But usually this breaks all ties after 1 round. You could do this after only 1 game. So I would recommend one of those 2 methods for determining tie breaks, and they're fairly simple. So now once you know what the tie breaks are, then it's really easy to run your Schenkel Swiss. So you basically place your teams in 1 or 2 very large pools of 8 or more. Pooled Schenkels require 1 or 2 playoff games after your pool play. If you can accommodate all the teams in 1 big pool, you can do it that way, and it works pretty easily. Allow enough rounds to determine a unique champion. If you have 8 teams, you need 3 rounds. We've been through this before. If you have 10 to 16 teams, you need 4 rounds of play. If you have 18 to 30 teams, you need 5 rounds of play. So if you have more than about 12 teams, it probably makes sense to divide your event up into 2 pools just to make it a little more efficient. All right, so you can assign your first round of games just by chance. We often have participants draw cards, and we just put a pack of cards with numbers corresponding to each sheet. And you have teams come in and pull a card, and that's the sheet they play on for their first game. And they'll match up against whoever pulls that same number card.
One comment about that, if I might, and that is, since we have 4 colleges that curl out of our club, we try to spread out teams that see each other every week. So we will assign those and then assign the others randomly.
Yeah. Just to make things a little more fun. But if you want to be totally fair and you're really concerned about, having a completely unbiased field, then you can just assign those first rounds by chance. So after the first game, then all teams have either won or lost their game, and all teams have completed their tiebreaker. So whatever that is going to be. And then after that round is completed, all teams are ranked first by their 1-loss record, then by their tiebreaker. And you just rank them from 1 to whatever. Okay, however many teams you have. And then in each subsequent round, the number 1 team plays the number 2 team, the number 3 team plays the number 4 team, number 5 plays number 6. This is really easy to do because once you rank the teams, you can just put this in a spreadsheet. Then 1 plays 2, 3 plays 4, 5 plays 6, right down the line. And then you lather, rinse, and repeat. You do this again for 3 rounds, however many rounds it takes to determine a unique winner. So this would be for a single Pool Schenkel. You want to avoid teams playing on the same sheet twice, but that's usually pretty easy to arrange, or on the same sheet twice in a row. You want to avoid repeat matches. It is quite rare that it comes up, but if for some reason, because of the way teams won and lost, you have a rematch with a team, that can usually be avoided by pairing the highest ranked team with the next highest ranked team they haven't yet played. And that's pretty easy to sort out. But we've run a bunch of these Schenkels, and it's amazing, but it hasn't come up in a very long time. If cumulative tiebreakers are used, you just update them after each game in the status. And then again, you always rank your teams by 1 loss first and then their tiebreak. So you do however many rounds you need to get a unique champion. So again, if you've got 8 teams, that's 3 rounds. If you've got 10 to 16, that's 4 rounds. And the champion is the team that's ranked number 1 after the completion of the event. Often that'll be an undefeated winner. And the runner-up is a team ranked number 2, and so on right down the line. So that's for a single Pool Schenkel. Fairly simple to run. I think if you had 3 sheets, you could run a 12-team Schenkel really easily. It would take you 2 rounds of play to get through, everybody, all 12 teams. You could run them out 6 at a time. If you're going to do a Pool Schenkel, if you got a really big event and you can do, say, pools of 8. So if you had 16 teams, I would run it into pools of 8. If you had 24 teams, I would run 3 pools of 8. But the ideal pool size really is equal to 2 times the number of sheets you have. So we've talked about that before. That's really efficient. If you got a 3-sheet club, 16 pools is perfect. If you got a 4-sheet club, 18 pools are perfect. But pools can be unequal size if necessary. You could have 8 and 6. If you have a 14-team spiel, no big deal. And if you have 18 pools or fewer, you conduct 3 preliminary rounds of play, just as you would for a single Pool Schenkel. Rank all your teams by 1 loss records in a tiebreaker when you're done. And then you conduct 2 single elimination playoff rounds to determine unique champion, pitting the teams from Pool A against the teams from Pool B. So the champion is the winner of the championship playoff. So the top Pool A team against the top Pool B team. The runner-up is the loser of that game. Third place winner is the second place A pool team versus the second place B pool team, and so on. You can run as many events as you like as you have ice time available. So if you're running a Pool Schenkel, then for 2 pools, the top 2 teams from each pool would advance. For 3 pools, you need to get 4 teams out of there to run a playoff. So you take the top team in each pool plus the best wild card. Again, it's easy to pick the wild card team. They're just the team with the best 1-loss record and tiebreaker after the top 3. And if you have 4 pools, that would be a pretty big Bonspiel. That would be like a 32-team event. The top team from each pool would advance to a championship playoff round. And you can run as many of these flights as you want if you have ice time. So you could run like the championship round and a consolation round. I think for the GNCC Mixed Doubles Championship, we ran 3 different flights. We ran an A flight, a B flight, and a C flight because we had enough ice time and sheets available. And normally you should do a bronze medal game to determine a 3rd place in any championship playoff. So if your top 4 teams are advancing to the playoffs, whoever loses that first playoff game should really populate that 3rd place event. Scheduling is easy as pie. So here's a 16-team event again on 4 sheets. It'll take 4 rounds of play to determine a winner. So it's going to take you 2 draws to process all 16 teams. So draws 1 and 2 will be your first Schenkel pool game. After those 2 draws are done, you rank all the teams and you pair them up. First place against second, 3rd place against 4th, so on and so forth. Then draws 3 and 4 would be your second round. And you total up all the win-loss records again and the tiebreakers again. And then you match them all up again for their 3rd round and so on and so forth. And then a 4th round. Whoever is the survivor in that 4th round is ranked number 1 as the champion. So very simple to run. You know your schedule. You're going to play 4 draws. The only thing you don't know is, depending on your win-loss record, will you play in draw 1 or 2, or 3 or 4, or 5 or 6, but you know that you're going to play 4 games. Everyone will play 4 games in this format. If you have a Pool Schenkel, then actually this is simpler to run for 16 teams, because you run your A pool out of 8 teams, and then you run your B pool out. While your B pool is playing, your Bonspiel director can be toting up all the results from draw 1 and ranking all the teams to get them ready to play in round 3. And when they're playing in round 3, your Bonspiel director will take the results of round 2, sorting out your your B pool teams and how you're going to match them up in round 4. And you just keep going. You'll play 3 rounds. A pool, play 3 rounds. B pool, play 3 rounds. If you're in the B pool, you know which 3 times you're playing. If you're in the A pool, you know what 3 times you're playing. And then you schedule 2 playoff games, semifinals and finals. And there's a nice break for you. So again, this is 8 rounds, 16 teams. You can play rounds 1 and 2 on Friday, rounds 3 through 6 on Saturday. You could play rounds 7 and 8, the semifinals and finals, on Sunday morning. So it's unlikely you'll have 24 teams, but if you do, you can do 3 pools of 8. Just to give you an idea of how long that would take to run, if you have 3 pools of 8, you need 9 preliminary draws to process them on 4 sheets. And then you'll need 2 playoff rounds. That's 11 draws. So you can see that as the number of teams goes up in your event, the number of times you have to have available for your event go up pretty dramatically. So if you want to see some examples of some Bonspiel designs, so I've put a zip drive together that has some bracketed Bonspiels from 8 to 16 teams, mostly on 4 sheets, but I think I've got one on 3 sheets as well. And I also have an example of a spreadsheet I used for a 3 Pool Schenkel for the GNCC Mixed Doubles Championship, so you can see how that spreadsheet might look to kind of rank teams with their tiebreakers between rounds. And I think MJ is going to provide you a link. You don't have to copy the link down, but there is a link.
I don't see anybody scribbling.
No. MJ will provide you the link so you can download the files and take a look at them. It'll give you some details about how you work out the timing and some of the bracketed Bonspiels, and then how the DSCs and teams are ranked and assigned to games in the Schenkels. All right. So if you have any other questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
Bravo. You even got done in less than an hour.
Hey ho.
All right. So if there aren't any questions about this or anything else, I will remind you, in the random draw that Roger was talking about, keep in mind the USCA college guidelines don't let teams play each other if they're from the same school until they get later in the Bonspiel. So it's one of the reasons we assign. It helps to have 6 sheets so we could keep them spread out.
And one of the things we do in our spiel is we make sure that if there are more than one school, more than one team from a school, they go into different pools.
Right.
So they can't meet until the playoffs.
Okay, so thank you for coming. You will get an email from me with a link to the zip file that Roger put together, a link to our YouTube page where this recording will live. And you okay with me sharing your PowerPoint, my dear?
Absolutely.
Okay, and the PowerPoint. Because after a certain point in time, I'm not a draw master. I glaze over. I need to go back and look at the written, and I'm much more proficient looking at the written than I am scrolling through video to find it. So thank you all for coming.